We've discussed how personality psychologists go about defining the dimensions of personality and what some of the major dimensions are. And now we'll ask the million-dollar question. Where does someone's personality come from? This is largely a developmental question. How does a zygote, which can't really be said to have any personality at all, become an infant that might be quite placid or very fussy, a toddler who's well-behaved or throws a lot of tantrums, a teenager who's outgoing or reserved, and finally an adult who's warm and friendly or generally suspicious of other people? We can frame this in terms of the classic nature-nurture question. How much of someone's personality is determined by genes, and how much is determined by the environment and experience? But as we've seen throughout this course, genes and experience always work together. And the real question is how someone's genes and environment work together to determine that person's personality. Let's start by looking at the heritability of personality, which attempts to quantify the percentage of variation in personality that can be explained by genes versus environment. As you might recall from our earlier discussion of the genetics of intelligence, researchers often look at monozygotic versus dizygotic twins to assess heritability. If the twins are monozygotic, they have exactly the same genes, whereas if they're dizygotic, they share an average of only 50% of the same genes. If a trait like IQ is highly heritable, then monozygotic twins should have similar scores on this trait, even if they're adopted into different families and reared apart. If one member of a twin pair has a high IQ, so should the other. If one member has a low IQ, so should the other. And if the degree of similarity is greater for monozygotic twins than for dizygotic twins, this indicates that genes are playing a significant role, because the monozygotic twins are more genetically similar than the dizygotic twins. Researchers can also look at non-twin siblings and compare them to people who are unrelated. Two siblings will typically be much more similar genetically than two people who are unrelated. So the extent to which pairs of siblings are similar in a trait like IQ can be used to estimate the contribution of genes to that trait. Research on personality using this approach has estimated that about half of the variation in personality among people can be explained by differences in their genes, and the other half can be explained by differences in their environment and experiences. However, this approach is complicated by environmental factors. If all the twins in a study of heritability are raised in similar environments, then genes will be the main thing that will vary across the individuals, and the heritability of the trait will necessarily be very high. However, if the twins vary widely in their environments, then the environmental differences will have more of an opportunity to impact the trait, and the heritability of the trait will be lower. So, we can say that genes can account for about half of the variation in personality across the types of middle-class American homes that have been the primary focus of twin studies. But the genetic contribution might be a lot lower if we considered a broader range of environments. Moreover, genes and environment can interact with each other. For example, this study shown here looked at the personality dimension of neuroticism in people with different variants of the serotonin transporter gene. They took saliva samples from the participants to determine their genotype, and they gave them a Big Five personality questionnaire to assess their neuroticism. They also asked the participants to provide a list of recent major life events, both positive and negative. The researchers found a weak relationship between negative life events and neuroticism when they looked at the entire sample, disregarding genotype. Having more negative life events was correlated with higher neuroticism. However, when they broke the sample into subgroups on the basis of which variant of the serotonin transporter gene each person had, they found that people with one genotype, called the short-short genotype, were highly sensitive to life events, whereas people with another genotype, the long-long genotype, were insensitive to life events. In other words, people with the short-short genotype showed relatively high levels of neuroticism if they had experienced generally negative life events, and relatively low levels of neuroticism if they experienced generally positive life events. But the people with the long-long genotype didn't show different levels of neuroticism depending on life events. This is a great example of how genes and environment interactively determine someone's personality. Not only does your personality depend on what genes you have and what events you experience, how your personality changes in responses to your experiences will depend on what genes you have. In general, a personality dimension like neuroticism or agreeableness is not the result of a single, simple, discrete psychological process or brain region or gene. Many things contribute to a given personality dimension. For example, Although a person's entire genotype clearly plays a strong role in explaining variations in personality, so that people who are highly genetically similar have more similar personalities than people who are genetically dissimilar, this doesn't mean that each individual aspect of personality corresponds to a single gene. There are many studies showing that a single gene, like the serotonin transporter gene, is correlated with personality, but the correlations are very small for individual genes. And many genes have been discovered that are correlated with personality. So hundreds or thousands of different genes contribute to personality, and each individual gene plays only a small role. Also, the effects of a given gene on your personality will likely depend on your environment. Having the short genotype for the serotonin transporter gene doesn't mean that you'll score higher on neuroticism than someone with the long genotype. If you have lots of positive life events, having the short genotype may mean that you'll be lower in neuroticism than someone with the long genotype. But if you have lots of negative life events and you have the short genotype, you may be higher in neuroticism than someone with the long genotype. So, as usual, nature and nurture work together in determining personality, just as they work together to produce every aspect of the mind and brain.